Thank you for being here. Very thankful for the opportunity to go over this material with you, present this topic, and discuss it with you. It's something that matters. I've wrestled with the seminar for a little while because, I'm kind of afraid of being the guy and the expert on this, because it's such a broad subject and it's so nuanced and everyone has their own story and their own experience and what about this and well you said this and this is my experience. And so with grace, with patience, with compassion, we're going to go through this together. We're going to try and be as biblically based and evidence-based as possible. Right? I'm not going to come with many of my own opinions, hopefully, and if I do, I'll be sure to point those times out. But so for the next 4 weeks, we are going to be discussing the broad topic of mental health in the church. And so I realize now that this is a fairly pointless graphic because nobody can read it, but it's basically just an infographic of different mental health statistics and percentages in our country, but mental health is declining. Whatever your definition is, however you evaluate someone's mental health, your own mental health, fact of the matter is statistics show that mental health is in a pretty steep decline across the world, but most specifically here in our country. From August 2020 to February 2021, the CDC reported an increase in the proportion of adults reporting recent symptoms of anxiety or depression from 36.4 to 41.5%. So 4 out of every 10 American adults reports ongoing symptoms of anxiety or depression. Mental health-related emergency department visits for ages 5 to 11 increased 24% since 2019. And for ages 12 to 17, the number has increased 31% compared to 2019. So these are mental health episodes significant enough to warrant a trip to the emergency department, increasing over 25% and over 30% in 5 to 11 and 12 to 17. From April 2020 to April 21, drug overdose deaths went over 100,000, which is up 28.5%. There was a 61% increase in drug use among 8th graders between 2016 and 2020. 1 in 8 teenagers abused an illicit substance in the last year. Suicide was the 12th leading cause of death overall in the United States, almost 46,000 suicide deaths in 2020. It was the 2nd leading cause of death among individuals 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. It was the 3rd leading cause of death among individuals between 15 and 24, and the 4th leading cause of death between ages 35 to 44. Almost twice as many suicides in 2020 as there were homicides. So almost 50,000 suicides and just short of 25,000 homicides. So, one other statistic here. There was an increase of over 650,000 adults in the U.S. with serious thoughts of suicide in the last year. All right? And that's not just out there. That's in here too. The church is not immune. Lifeway research found that 23% of pastors say they've had personal struggles with mental health. 12% of that 23% has received a diagnosis. 49% they rarely or never speak on the topic in their congregation. In 2016, 85% of pastors rated their mental well-being as good or excellent, according to a Barna poll. In 2021, it was down to 60%. Almost 40% of pastors polled in October 2021 seriously considered stepping away from full-time ministry. Only half of those pastors said they were doing well relationally. Only a third of those pastors said they were doing well emotionally. So these statistics are not just for people out there. They're for people in here. They're for people standing up here as well. I'm currently counseling a pastor of a church here in the Winston-Salem area, right? And so I can tell you that this is not just a problem for other people, right? That this is a problem no one is immune to. They're struggling, and one of the primary reasons is because they don't feel like they have anyone that they can talk to, right? They're the pastor. They have to uphold this image. Any weakness, any vulnerability, any flaw or perceived flaw can put their livelihood at risk. One poll showed that 50% of pastors who admit to having mental health struggles or challenges end up fired. There's a story, one pastor went on sabbatical. Halfway through his sabbatical was diagnosed with a mental health disorder, and he was asked not to return from his sabbatical. And so I'm not saying that there's not cause for that, or that there's not sufficient reason or reasoning for why maybe a pastor shouldn't be shepherding a flock pertaining to or in regards to his specific struggles. But carte blanche, it should not be, if you're struggling, you don't have a job here, right? We need to come alongside these people. And then just the growing number, just the awareness and the voice that church trauma and church abuse has received here recently is growing, and certainly thanks to technology, thanks to the targeted awareness to the matter. We have people sitting here now that are victims of that are on a journey of healing from past church abuse and trauma. So some who would be willing to talk about it, some who would just, because of the way they feel like they might be judged or shamed or guilted, that's just not something that they're going to mention. So therefore, that remains a significant and intense area of their life that community is not engaging in their life with, in their walk with, right? So this is why we're going to have this seminar. Mental health is declining, and people are not getting the help they need. Over half of the adults with a mental illness did not receive treatment last year. This number continues to increase annually, treatment being either counseling or medication. Over 60% of youth with major depressive episode did not receive any mental health treatment, which corresponds with suicide rates. According to a survey published earlier this year, almost 40% of youth say that they have no one to talk to and that no one knows them well. 27% of youth say they have one or fewer adults in their lives that they can turn to if they need to talk. Right? And so that's not always the lack of presence of an adult, but it's just the fear of shame and ridicule and just getting over that hurdle of this is probably the most vulnerable I'll ever be. I have to be very, very careful if I choose to share this and with whom I choose to share this. I think, unfortunately, what it shows is that there is work to be done in creating a community or creating a culture. Here, at least, is where we can start with giving voice to that, right, and allowing people to share those struggles. Why this seminar? Because the church should be the first place that people can turn to for addressing these issues. So I'm not saying that every pastor, deacon, elder, layperson, congregant needs to be equipped to deal with bipolar disorder and anxiety and depression and things like that and suicidal ideation, but it shouldn't be that we're not the first place that people are turning to with their initial thoughts, right? I mean, whether it be just for a referral, whether it be just for prayer and then continued support or counseling, we don't all need to turn into prescribers and experts in the DSM-5, right? I'm not suggesting that we need that in order to be a healthy community. What I'm saying is that we need to be involved in relationship with each other at a level that those things are not left off the table when it comes to discipleship and walking with one another, okay? Does that make sense? All right. And I forgot to mention that if any of you are monitoring the droopiness of my eye as the hour goes on, it's because I was stung by a yellow jacket yesterday. So and I don't think it's done drooping, so if it just keeps going, I'll be fine. Everyone will be fine. We'll just keep moving, okay? But I was going to relegate everyone to like the back 3 rows, and I just wasn't going to have to mention it. All right. So what will, at the end of this 4 weeks, when we look back and say that was beneficial, profitable, we can call that a success, what will that look like? Number one, I think it would look like that people on the ends of the spectrum, on the extreme ends, one or the other, whether it's purely a spiritual problem, there's no biological basis, this is not a physiological matter, this is spiritual, and it is dealt with prayer and greater trust or dependence in Jesus. Or on the other side, I'm a Christian, but these are scientific, these are psychological matters, psychiatric matters, and therefore we're going to deal with them as such. Whatever side of the spectrum you may find yourself on, I hope as a result of this seminar series that everyone moves more towards the middle. Right? We understand the complexity of being both body and soul. Right? To neglect that is to diminish God's creative power and wisdom. We become a place where people can share their struggles, all of them, right? Like we've talked about before. I know the term safe space has its own certain cultural connotations, but that is what a church needs to be. Steve Austin, a pastor that actually committed suicide in 2021, wrote a book a few years back about his experience of unsuccessfully trying to commit suicide back in 2012. He wrote a book called Hiding in the Pews, with the main question being, if the culture in the church was different, would that have changed his story? Right? Now, there's no definitive answer to that, and ultimately he was overtaken by the struggles, and he did commit suicide back in 2021. But the question is, can we create or mature our community here to where that's not a question that we're asking? Well, if we were just more open with each other, if we felt like we had the opportunity and the place to share these struggles, hopefully we're going to eliminate the cause or the opportunity to ask those types of questions, at least here, okay? Steve Austin writes in his book, Hiding in the Pews, healing cannot happen when people don't feel safe to show their weakness, struggle, uncertainty, and pain. If people have to hide in the pews to protect themselves from judgment, shame, or ostracization, the church becomes a force of destruction, keeping the children of God trapped in bondage, suffering in silence. But when a church champions vulnerability and establishes safety within its walls, especially for those who are suffering, the healing power of God can set the captives free. So you might look at yourself, you might look around at the rest of us and say, how can somebody not feel safe here? Right? This is a loving, a kind, a compassionate family. Right? People say it, but that's one of the, Rich says that's one of his greatest compliments he receives about this church is our hospitality, our openness, our lovingness towards each other. So how can somebody not feel safe here, right? But are we open? Are we vulnerable? Are we honest? Do we share our mental and emotional difficulties with each other? We share our physical burdens. We ask for and receive help readily in those regards. But how many of us are truly struggling with mental or emotional problems that are too afraid to open up about? I know you're out there. Statistics say that 1 in 4 of you are reading this or listening to this and aligning with some of the things that I'm mentioning here. So I know you're out there. As the church counselor, I know for a fact some of you are out there. And if you haven't felt like you can open up about what really ails your heart and mind, I'm sorry, but I am here. I'm ready to listen and be supportive, and I know that it is the goal of this church to be that type of family as well. Okay? So hopefully this series will help us be more open on both sides of the fence. You can say, well, I would never shame someone who came to me about their addiction. I would never shame or judge or discredit or minimize somebody who came to me about their depression or about their anxiety. Maybe not. right? Maybe if someone came to you, if I came to you and said, hey, I'm struggling with this addiction, or I'm just anxious all the time, maybe you wouldn't shame me or judge me, right? But how is it behind the scenes that you're thinking about it? When we're talking about creating a culture, how is it that I may hear you talk about it, right? It might not even be, I might not ever come to you about my suicidal ideations because I've heard you talking with Wade about how suicide is selfish and how you can't imagine how someone would ever do that, right? So now Wade's no longer a resource, right? That's a part of this body that I'm not gonna open up to, right? And so we're not just talking about those face-to-face conversations when someone comes to you, we're talking about the work, the groundwork behind the scenes that even identifies yourself as someone that people can talk to, right? And so if you're on the record saying, I don't know how people could ever be addicted to anything, right? Why don't they just stop? Then the kid who's having trouble, the youth who's having trouble with looking at porn in this congregation isn't gonna come talk to you about that, right? Because they already know it's not honest if you say, hey, yeah, we all struggle with that. Let's walk together with that. That's a front, right? Because they've already heard you share what you think about that. So when we're talking about creating a culture of openness and vulnerability, it starts with those conversations that we may feel like people aren't hearing, or we may feel like they don't matter much, but to someone struggling, those things do matter. Let me be clear though, openness, transparency, vulnerability, safety, these are not the end. This isn't the point, okay? We want to have a culture here, create a culture, a family that is characterized by openness and vulnerability and transparency, not in an end of itself, but so that we use that as a vehicle for discipleship and Godward movement, okay? So this is where I really want us to push back against this idea of being a safe space or a vulnerable place, because for a lot of people, that means that's the end. That's the goal we're trying to accomplish. For us, what I propose is that we use that as a means to the end, right? So that we can use people's willingness to be open and vulnerable with each other about everything that's on their plate, so that we can address their entire person and walk with their entire person towards God. Okay? Fair? I did a lot of, typical research as far, reading articles and books and things like that. But I conducted a lot of interviews too with various professionals, biblical counselors, clinical counselors, psychologists, just along the spectrum, some licensed clinical social workers. And I asked them a bunch of questions. One of the questions was, what do you want Christians to know about mental health? And this is an answer from a licensed clinical social worker. I want Christians to know that we are probably currently facing and will continue to face a huge mental health crisis over the next several years. Our access to information about tragedies and the push to be involved in every world or American crisis is overwhelming for many. People are facing increasing financial stress with no solutions. We have a major housing crisis. Our mental health system is very broken. It is often unaffordable and very challenging to access services. Substance use and related deaths have been rising for years. The list goes on. All of these things are coming to a head, and people are scared and desperate. Christ demonstrated his love by coming to earth and meeting people where they are at with compassion, kindness, and truth. We should be doing the same. Knowing that many in our community are facing mental health struggles, it may be wise to do some reading on mental health, prepare yourself to be ready to help someone, open the door for people to be honest with you about how they're doing, and identify available resources. So we'll be on that track if this is a successful seminar. Okay? Any thoughts or questions so far? All right. So then, what is mental health? It's our emotional, psychological, social well-being. That is from mentalhealth.gov. The World Health Organization includes It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. So when we're talking about mental health, we're really just talking about, like you would evaluate or assess your physical health. Is everything working properly? Is everything moving and working and running the way it should? This is our gauge for mental health as well, just obviously as it pertains to immaterial things, the soul, the mind. And we've all faced this before, whether it was chronic or persistent, or whether it was momentary, but all of our mental health at times has suffered, and for some of us, pretty severely, right? Having a history with addiction, I don't want to say it's easy to go back there, but there have definitely been times since then that have played on my mental health towards that end. I remember back in 2020. So back in 2019 is when I, stopped working, lost my job, and that also came with our place to live. And so the beginning of 2020, January and February, was trying to find a new job and then starting working for the state, which was an hour commute to the prison that I was counseling at. So I was leaving at like 5:20 in the morning, getting home at like 6:15. Right, I was gone for 13 hours a day. I would come home. I would try and do as much family time as possible. Then we would pack because we had to be out by March 15th or something. So we had to move out of our house, and I was in school. And so there would be nights where I'd get home 6:15, 6:30, try and do some family time, eat a meal, pack a few boxes, write a paper, maybe be in bed by 1 or 2 in the morning, and then back on the road at 5:15, 5:20 the next morning. And I remember one night, just finished writing a paper, and I remember I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, and I thought to myself, I said, if ever I was going to relapse, tonight would be the night. And I don't share that story that often because even for someone who's pushing openness and vulnerability and honesty, those are tough moments to share, right? To admit that your mind goes to a place so dark when you otherwise feel, healthy, mentally healthy at least, right? I've never considered myself as someone to struggle with that on a consistent basis. So that's not easy to share, even as someone who wants people to share, right? It's a hard example to set, but that is what we need to be modeling for each other, right? Because the healthiest among us are going to have those times. We're going to hear from people throughout the course of this seminar, I think at least in the third week, from people who are otherwise healthy and have had severe struggles like that, right? And so we hope to model for you this type of openness, but like I said, not as it being the end, right? Just so that we're a community where everyone shares their feelings, right? We want to be able to share those struggles so that we expose them and so that we have the help and the support of this family to deal with them, to walk in a Godward direction. So what is a mental health disorder? This is about half of the definition. And so with great hesitancy, I did bring it up because I talk about it a lot, and I figured I should show you guys that it is at least real, the DSM-5, okay? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So this is basically, it's been called the Bible of Psychiatry because this is over 1,000 pages of information about mental health disorders and diagnoses. So, and they did just come out with a text revision just a couple months ago. So the 5th edition came out in 2013. This isn't even the newest one. So it's continually a work of progress. But it's a syndrome categorized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. It does go on to say that culturally appropriate responses would not be considered a mental health disorder, right? So according to how a certain culture would typically react to a stressor or, trauma or something like that, you would have to take that into account before you would consider it a mental health disorder. This isn't just good information to have. This isn't something that's just worthwhile to note. Alan Francis, he's a psychiatrist, and he was actually the editor-in-chief of the DSM-3, and that was the 80s, I believe, 1980s. But he wrote a book called Saving Normal, and he writes about the influence of the DSM. He says, the DSM has a lot of societal influence because of the crucial boundary it sets between what is normal and what is abnormal. The DSM determines all sorts of important things that have enormous impact on people's lives, like who is considered well and who is sick, what treatment is offered and who pays for it, who gets disability benefits, who is eligible for mental health, school, vocational, or other services, who gets to be hired for a job, who can adopt a child or pilot or plane or qualify for life insurance, right? So this is not just a good definition to have in the back of your head, right? There are significant societal consequences to how we define what a mental health disorder is and how it plays out practically in our lives and the world around us. In 2019, one in every 5 people that were receiving disability compensation was due to a mental health disorder, right? So we're now, at least here in America, 20%, 3 years ago, 20% of people who were receiving disability were doing so on the basis of their inability to work due to a mental health disorder, right? So there are significant consequences that are affecting not just the people out there, like I said, but the people in here as well. In most cases, insurance will not even pay for mental health services without a diagnosis. So the diagnosis matters. This thing is filled with codes, right? And the code is what tells insurance that they need to pay for this medicine or they need to pay for this counseling or treatment or whatever the case may be. So the diagnoses are coming at a faster rate and continuing to increase as the standard for what is a mental health disorder continues to grow. But as important as a diagnosis is, it does not determine your life. It is not your identity. It is not who you are, right? As overwhelming and as all-encompassing as whatever struggle it is that you're dealing with, it doesn't define you. It doesn't identify you. It is not who you are, okay? Thoughts or questions up until this point?
Chris, have you noticed or are you aware of what changes happened in the DSM? Like some things that used to be considered a mental disorder are no longer considered a mental disorder?
Oh yeah, that happens in every edition. Homosexuality, right? That used to be in the DSM-3. That was a mental health disorder. It's not anymore. There's different, classifications as far as what age you can receive a diagnosis, and so now there's, from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, it used to be bipolar, but now there's pediatric bipolar, so children under 6 have to meet certain diagnostic criteria. And it continues to evolve, like it used to be, in the DSM-4, it was just addictions. Now it's a substance use disorder because it's a chronic brain disease, according, to the DSM and the powers that be. So that is now along a spectrum of mild, moderate, severe versus just having an addiction. Same thing with like autism spectrum disorder, right? That is now seen on a spectrum versus a certain or specific diagnosis. So, those changes are The DSM-5 for the first time included a non-substance addiction in gambling. And it's assumed that next and later editions will have like screen use disorder, for literally being addicted to any type of screen will be considered a chronic brain disease here in the near future probably. So, good question. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Most commonly diagnosed mental health disorders. And so the reason I'm going to go over some of this diagnostic criteria for these top 4 is so that you can listen and then self-diagnose. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that. No. Don't do that. Yeah. I think you'll find, the reason I'm doing this is I think that you'll find that we're in a very psychologized society right now, okay? Everyone is familiar with psychological vernacular. Everyone can say they've experienced this or they have this or they struggle with this, and we don't belittle any of that. But when we hold it up against the diagnostic criteria, what the DSM says, in order to receive this diagnosis, you have to meet these criteria. I think you'll find that it's the way we use it commonly is not, it's a lot more loose and generalized than what the experts would say is the mental health disorder. So there's that, and then also it does, especially like, for a counselor or for those who want to walk with people and build these types of relationships where you are engaging deeply in each other's lives and through those relationships, someone says they're struggling with this or they've received this diagnosis, then maybe you at least have some framework, right? You have some groundwork to say, okay, I'm familiar with why somebody said this might be, what you're struggling with, or may have been able to give it a clinical label. Just so to give you a little bit of familiarity with it as well. 19% of everyone with a mental health diagnosis in the United States last year, 19% was for an anxiety disorder. The DSM says fear is the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat, whereas anxiety is anticipation of future threat. Obviously, these two states overlap, but they also differ, with fear more often associated with surges of autonomic arousal, necessary for fight or flight, thoughts of immediate danger and escape behaviors, and anxiety more often associated with muscle tension and vigilance in preparation for future danger and cautious or avoidant behaviors. And so with anxiety disorders, we have generalized anxiety, social anxiety or social phobia, panic disorder, separation anxiety, selective mutism, other specific phobias like animal, blood, injury, fear of needles, things like that. So some of the criteria here is excessive anxiety and worry occurring more days than not for at least 6 months about a number of events or activities. The individual finds it difficult to control the worry. The anxiety and worry are associated with 3 or more of the following symptoms: being present more days than not, restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbances. And so those are some of the criteria for if someone comes to you and says, I've just come back from the doctor or, speaking with a psychiatrist or psychologist, and this is where I've been diagnosed with this type of anxiety disorder. Those are some of the things that they're struggling with. Right? Whether or not you believe or agree that it's diagnosable, at least we know now what it is that they're struggling with, right? They're having trouble sleeping. They're anticipating dangerous or imminently dangerous events in their life that are, the DSM calls it clinically disturbing, right? It's affecting the way that they do life, that they socialize, that they work, how they eat, sleep, all that stuff. So wherever it is you fall in agreement with these diagnoses, we can't disagree with people who with the fact that people are struggling with this stuff, right? You can't say, well, that's not, I think generalized anxiety is silly, right? Why do we have to put a label on everything? Okay, feel that way. But can you still not tend to their worry? Can you still not tend to their, their anxiousness, their fear of danger and fear of being threatened and things like that, right? Can we still not attend to that which we can attend to, right? Major depressive disorder makes up 8%. And this is 5 or more of the following symptoms that have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. So depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Significant weight loss or gain. Insomnia or hypersomnia. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. Diminished ability to think or concentrate. Indecisiveness nearly every day. Recurrent thoughts of death, not just the fear of dying, but recurrent suicidal ideation with or without a plan or an actual suicide attempt. Any thoughts, questions about that? Those are the two really common ones that we see clinically diagnosed and also just used commonly in public.
When I was studying some of this, when I was taking classes, one of the things that was helpful for me is that none of these things you can just, draw some blood and diagnose. These are titles that experts have given to a group of symptoms. So whether you agree with it or not, that's how these things have come to be, because they see patterns of, okay, well, these symptoms come together, these symptoms come together, so we're going to give it this label so that people who have those symptoms or professionals who are trying to help those, again, going back to insurance, can, come together, and that's why certain, there's new diagnoses in the DSM-5 that weren't in 4, because they're like, well, this set of people, it doesn't fall here, they have this symptom, it doesn't fall here, so let's make up another title to give a name to this group of symptoms.
Yeah, that is very helpful. And the APA uses the word syndrome, which just means a collection or a group of symptoms, right, to define a mental health disorder. And so, we're not talking etiology here. We're not talking causes. We're talking the symptoms, right? What we can visibly discern as, and having a way of categorizing them so that we can best target our efforts, okay? That is a helpful distinction. Thank you. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I think some of you may be, this one is a lot. This is like 5 pages of diagnostic criteria in the DSM. So I wasn't going to put it all in my notes or put it all up there. But it's pretty strict. And I think, this is one of the ones that we can have a tendency to use more loosely than we should, at least according to the DSM criteria, because it's pretty strict here. You'll see exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. All right, that's the first criterion. Presence or intrusion symptoms, which would be recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories, dreams, dissociative reactions, like flashbacks or completely losing touch with reality in a present moment, intense and prolonged psychological and or physiological reactions to external or internal cues or triggers. And so one of the things, one of the reasons that I keep wanting to say Alan Bacon, Alan Francis wrote his book, Saving Normal, because of a growing concern, something along the lines of what April mentioned was a growing concern of medicalizing or psychologizing normal life experiences. And so We do see that in some of these, especially in these top 4 diagnosed disorders. And like I said, Alan Francis is not the only person, but I just thought it was interesting that someone that was the editor-in-chief of one of these, handbooks said, I think we ought to be careful, because with the idea of this person doesn't fit here, this person doesn't fit here, let's create a place for this person to fit, where some experts in the field are saying maybe they're just dealing with life, right? Maybe there's just this is just a season. Maybe this is his challenge. Maybe it's not diagnosable, right? And the danger that we continue to create by creating new categories and new diagnoses is that we've lost normal. There's another book, I forget the author, who wrote The Disappearance of Sadness, right? And these are respected people in their field. We'll quote here in a minute Joanna Moncrief. She's a professor at the University College London of critical and social psychiatry in London, right? And she's pretty serious about her disagreement with medication and biological roots and causes of some of this stuff that seems to be so popular today. So these are respected people who are really taking like a philosophical and a societal look at things and saying, this is great. This is good that we have the opportunity to target and really hone in on people's issues and concerns without a lot of wasted time trying to figure out what's going on. Nevertheless, is it becoming so broad that we're actually losing just living life and just having difficult life challenges and experiences? Russ and then Ernie.
You're talking about people being diagnosed with difficulties. Okay, there's obviously going to be a milking of the system. Oh, look, I've got this difficulty. Do you really, though? That's going to happen. And I think, to kind of double up on something you said, is we're not talking about, oh, I got depressed one weekend, but then I got over it. We're not talking about, oh, I lost a loved one, I was sad for, a couple of weeks, whatever. These are things where this is presenting, not an amateur psychologist, just a dude who deals with stuff. This creates some real problems in trying to have a normal life. Mm-hmm. And it's like, hey man, a just man falls 7 times and gets back up. What if he can't get up though? Mm-hmm. You would look at that guy and say, man, there's something wrong here. Why can't you get up? Mm-hmm. You're clearly having a struggle. Well, this is a very deeply internalized struggle, and a lot of this stuff, it's not something that goes away. And it's something in you want to call it biology, you want to call it thinking, it's such a complicated thing. But it's this ongoing struggle with these things. And there is a widespread attempt to be like, look, let's make sure we're diagnosing all these things. Well, am I depressed then? Look at these diagnoses. Am I depressed? I don't know. Are you struggling with life? No, not really. I'm doing pretty good. Well, then you're probably okay. If you can internally find, man, I'm trying to, there might be something going on here.
Yeah. No, and these are all worthwhile points to make for sure. And there's going to be ways to come at it from either side. For instance, there's a whole category of sexual disorders, right, in the DSM. One of them being Fraudulistic Disorder, and it is. Let me just read it. Recurrent and intense sexual arousal from touching or rubbing against a non-consenting person as manifested by fantasies, urges, or behaviors. So this is a mental health disorder that's diagnosable, and there was a orthodontist in Philadelphia who was indicted for and pled guilty to fondling a teenage patient. He subsequently maintained that he was entitled to $5,000 a month in disability from his insurance company because he was unable to continue his practice due to a mental health diagnosis, right? And so we move towards the middle, right? We don't stay on one end or the other, right? We see, this is a very helpful book too, by the way, Descriptions and Prescriptions. This is a guy with CCEF, but he has a medical doctorate, and he's been a practicing counselor for years. So that's a very helpful resource. But so as we discuss and as we think through some of these things that are no doubt very personal for some of us, and for others of us, we tend to kind of turn our nose up at because we've never had excessive worry or anxiety or sadness or grief or anything like that. We move towards the middle. Ernie.
Therefore, but someone they were emotionally involved with had been exposed, and so they kind of absorbed that from them. Is that within the criteria there?
It's called secondary.
Bipolar disorder. So bipolar 1. Now, my daughter, when she was like a year old, was called bipolar. Not clinically, but because she was throwing a temper tantrum 1 minute and then like literally the next second was singing a song with her grandma, right? And so, but that's just one of the ways that we use it, right? If someone has a mood swing, they're bipolar. And I don't think we mean diagnosable. We're just saying that just kind of indicates our general attitude or how we think about it is, being bipolar means you're sad and then you're happy and then you're sad and then you're happy and you never know which one you're going to get or when it's going to change. Bipolar 1 is just a past or a present manic episode. One episode of mania needs to last for at least a week, needs to cause marked impairment in social or occupational functioning, often necessitates hospitalization. It may have psychotic features within that episode. So 1 week-long manic episode is the only criteria necessary for bipolar 1 disorder. Bipolar 2 needs at least one hypomanic episode. Hypomanic is just a little less intense episode of mania. So hypomanic lasts 4 days, doesn't cause significant impairment in functioning, doesn't necessitate hospitalization. So at least one hypomanic episode and one major depressive episode. If you have had one major depressive episode and one hypomanic episode in your past or presently, then that would warrant a bipolar 2 disorder, right? And so a depressive episode has to last at least 4 days, and it has some really significant criteria. So it's not just I'm happy and then I'm sad, I might have bipolar, right? It's like for a week long, I was super energetic. I was super goal-driven. I was super motivated. I was super outgoing. And then, a few months later, I had this 4 or 5 day episode where I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to eat. I didn't, I had no motivation. I didn't have any pleasure in all the things I used to love doing, right? So all I'm doing here is saying that for the way we self-diagnose, we probably wouldn't meet the mark for the strictness of an actual mental health disorder. So that being said, if someone comes to you and says, I do have this diagnosis, then at least they've taken it seriously. Someone else, some professional has taken it seriously, looked at the syndrome, looked at the set of symptoms and said, I think this is what we're dealing with here. Okay? All right. $1 million question. Who knows, right? Who knows? So, the science isn't quite there yet. Alan Francis, he says, he calls biological psychiatry, which is the field that discusses this question here, he calls it homeless, right? Because he says they've tried to make their home with the hard sciences, but they don't quite have the hard science to house themselves with the hard sciences. And so there's a lot of science for that, but this is from the DSM itself. While the DSM has been the cornerstone of substantial progress in reliability, it has been well recognized by both the APA and the broad scientific community working on mental disorders that past science was not mature enough to yield fully validated diagnoses, that is, to present consistent, strong, and objective scientific validators of individual DSM disorders. The science of mental disorders continues to evolve, right? So the professionals themselves in this field who are, comprising this book are saying, we know still that we're not scientifically backed. So they're saying saying the science is evolving. There's a lot of people though that say the science can't evolve enough, right? That we can't get to a point where we're saying this is what causes depression. This is what causes anxiety. This is so symptoms and diagnostic criteria. They deal with the symptoms, the consequences of a disorder, but we don't have the science to say this is why you have depression, right? And we know it's being very vocal now, this field, about boasting the type of science that they do have, as far as what causes depressed mood, what causes ADHD, things like that. But we'll get to how that might not really be saying what they propose to say either. We talked about this, April brought this up, categories of symptoms, not causes, right? Even the science can be a little misleading. The Harvard Review of Psychiatry put out an article called Messaging in Biological Psychiatry, Misrepresentations, Their Causes, and Potential Consequences. And so they just go on to cite a number of published studies that, for sometimes very intentional reasons, left out some necessary information or omitted things or twisted things. But they stand to, one, make money. They stand to leave their mark on their field, a lasting mark on their field, if they can be groundbreaking. So we can understand the motivation behind it. But for example, 74 randomized controlled trials of antidepressants registered with the FDA. 38 reported a positive effect. So half of the trials of antidepressants registered with the FDA reported a positive effect. 37 of those trials were published in peer-reviewed journals. 36 trials were judged as negative by the FDA. 22 of those studies were not published. 11 were published but reported positive outcomes. Only 3 of those published trials, only 3 of those trials published results that stated results in agreement with the FDA's judgment that this medicine did not have a positive effect, right? And so, things like that. Studies reported the brain level of the dopamine transporter is 70% higher in patients suffering from ADHD. However, the authors failed to specify that 4 out of the 6 patients had a previous history of psychostimulant therapy. And subsequent studies have shown that prolonged psychostimulant treatment increases this level of the dopamine transporter, right? So there's science, seemingly, but it can be misleading, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes very intentionally. 159 summaries from studies associating ADHD with the 7R allele. I'm just reading this, I'm not acting like I know what I'm talking about. Only 25 summaries include the fact that the size of this association was weak. So 23%. 23% of this 159 summaries were able to find a link between ADHD and the 7R allele. What they left out was, so they used this 23%. See, we have found something genetically for the cause of ADHD. what they refused to leave out, 84% of the studies that were published on this study, what they left out was that 17% of the control children had this allele as well. So the difference was 6%, right? But they were able to say 23% of children diagnosed with ADHD have this, whereas 17% of those who didn't have ADHD also had it. So we don't, that's probably way more interesting to me than it is to you guys. So I'll stop with that. But continued. Unlike the subject matter of the physical sciences, people have motives, interests, and purposes. They make choices and do things for reasons. They cannot simply be understood as the inevitable product of a given set of conditions, right? And so this is why most respectable figures in this field are not going to go on record saying, we will at some point have the science to back biological psychiatry, right? Because of all the invariables, because of all the intangibles that the hard sciences don't deal with, but the social sciences do. And so that was from Joanna Moncrief. I referenced her earlier. So you'll either agree or disagree with this line of thinking, and that will make all the difference in your approach to your own mental health and someone else's. We are material and immaterial, body and soul, each affecting the other. If you don't believe this, then go stub your toe, right? If when you stub your toe, that physical pain is going to influence your thoughts, your mind, your behavior, your words, right? And vice versa. You know, think about the last time maybe you felt embarrassed about something, right? And that's, you know, that is a immaterial feeling, but you feel it in your body, right? It doesn't take long for your physical body to receive the message that you're embarrassed, right? Your face is flushed, you start sweating, your heartbeat starts racing, right? And so the body and the mind affect each other. They strongly influence each other. And to approach this subject too far on one side of that fence or on one side of that spectrum, like I said, is to diminish and really disrespect the way God made us, okay? So we want to be careful with that. We're not ruling out any possibility that these disorders may have a biological root, but like I said, it's not quite hard science yet. Moncrief, she says, we need to distinguish brain activity from brain disease. Saying it's not a neurological disease is not the same thing as saying it doesn't affect the brain or that we can't impact the brain and the way the brain responds. Just because a part of the brain lights up does not mean it is a neurological disease. And I'll stop there. We have a few minutes for questions, thoughts. I am going to stop there, but I just want to teach you guys a little bit.
So I'm a little bit wary about asking this because I'm realizing there's a whole ton of stuff a whole ton of stuff that I know you have to leave stuff out, but also just, I'm not real familiar with this. If there's symptoms for these things and it seems that's what they're treating, why aren't they looking for the root?
They're trying to. They're trying to. There's, well, you're just going to have to wait. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are going to do that. Especially when we talk about medicine and stuff like that.
I don't know if you mentioned this because I walked in after you had started, but the verse that came in my mind about all this stuff and things you're saying and just, you know, the attitude of
Pastor here in the church and the way he deals with things, I'm just like, man, so what are we saying? Well, Galatians 6:1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. And the word fault there refers to falling beside the way. So we're not, that doesn't even necessarily include, oh, well, look, he gave into this sinful temptation. He's just completely overtaken by something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does he need?
Mm-hmm.
Man, he needs somebody to just come beside and be like, listen, God is awesome, and he loves you, and I love you, and we're just going to walk together through this.
Yeah, yeah, and the goal here is not that everyone is like, oh yeah, I'm fully equipped, right? But I rely on people not feeling fully equipped, right? And that's why when we get calls from pastors, often just, hey, I have someone in my congregation who's dealing with this. I feel like this is out of my wheelhouse. I feel like I'm not fully equipped. That's not the goal, right? And it might just be walking with someone as they seek out different options for treatment and counseling and things like that. Yeah. So as a result of this, we're not hoping that everyone is able, to deal with various mental health disorders, but that we're more willing to share that we struggle in this way, and we can not shy away or run away from these challenges, and continue to walk with people as they deal with them. Okay, good. Let's pray. We'll finish up. Father, you are good and wise, and you have designed us in your image. We know that we are fallen, we are corrupt, we are broken, and God, we know that the greatest consequence of this world's brokenness is the way our minds work, and the way we perceive things, the way we deal with situations, the way we handle things. God, we know that they are almost always leave something to be desired. So God, we thank you for your word, that highlights this truth for us, that tells us that what we need is a transformed and a renewed mind, that we need the mind of your son Jesus, with which to think and act and respond. And God, when it doesn't work the way that we think it should, or the way that your word says it should, God, we thank you for this community and this family that will walk alongside us and help us think about this biblically and support us in our journey. So, God, we just thank you that this church gives opportunity and gives voice to a topic like this. God, thank you for the turnout that shows that people do care, and that this is a topic on a lot of people's minds. So, God, I pray that this hour was profitable and beneficial for us, that you were glorified with our time here, and that you would continue to work as we continue to look at this subject. And it's in your son's name we pray.